Thank you for coming on this Friday before spring break, where I understand parking is very limited for some reason. I'm going to let John introduce the speaker today, but thanks for coming. And we do have a few more speakers this semester after spring break.
Hello, my name is John. So Dr. Chandler received his Bachelor's of Science in Wildlife Biology from the University of Vermont, and both his Master's and PhD in Wildlife Conservation from the University of Massachusetts Amherst. After 3 years as a postdoc at the USGS Patuxent Wildlife Research Center, Dr. Chandler joined the faculty at the University of Georgia, where he is now Daniel B. Warno, Professor of Forestry and Natural Resources. His lab conducts research on animal population dynamics to understand how environmental change and management actions affect demography and population viability. Results from his research have appeared in journals such as Biological Reviews, Ecological Monographs, Natural Ecology and Nature Ecology and Evolution, and Wildlife Monographs. Dr. Chandler is one of the primary developers of the R package Unmarked and co-author of the book Spatial Capture Recapture. His work has been recognized by the National Science Foundation's Early Career Award, the Ecological Society of America's Ecological Forecasting Outstanding Publication Award, and the TWS Biometrics Working Group's Appreciation Award for Long-Term Achievement. It's also, proud to say, a member of my committee, and that's pretty good. So let's welcome Dr. Chandler.
Thank you, John, for that generous introduction, and thank you to Casey and the other graduate students for the invitation to be here. I really appreciate the nice turnout. Thanks also to Aaron and David for hosting me. Really enjoyed my conversations with folks so far, and I'll be around for the rest of the day. So if you get an opportunity, come to the grad student lunch or some of the other meetings. Look forward to speaking. So the edge that I'm talking about in the title here, population dynamics on the edge. The edge I'm referring to is the edge of the geographic range. And specifically, I'm going to be focusing on these southern range margins. Okay, so these low latitude populations right at the southern edge of the range are often referred to as trailing edge populations, because we know that many of these ranges are going to be shifting forward, northward in this case, in the northern hemisphere, in response to climate change and other factors. And what we really want to understand is how are these populations going to respond? So there's good reason to believe that they're either going to have to adapt to novel conditions, they're going to have to be able to track their climate niche through dispersal, or they're going to go locally extinct. And we think that many of these populations are quite unique genetically. And so we're trying to answer those types of questions. And to understand which of those outcomes is most likely, we really need to figure out what are the mechanisms governing range shifts and limiting the distributions of these populations. So this is the range map, the breeding range for the Canada warbler shown here on the right. What I'm going to show is that there's quite a lot of species with very similar ranges that occur here in the Southern Appalachians where we've been doing this research. I want to begin by thanking the people that really made this all possible, especially the grad students, postdocs, research coordinators. These are the guys waking up at 4 a.m. to do bird work. Spend a lot of time out there running mist nets, doing point counts, target netting, in very steep terrain. I'm sure you guys are familiar with the mountains around here. But they put in a tremendous amount of work to get this done. We've also had a great partnership with Cedar Shoals High School in Athens, and have had a lot of fun bringing some high school students into the project. So what I'm going to do today is I'm going to first talk about the diversity and status of these trailing edge populations in the Southern Appalachian Mountains. And then I'm going to zoom in on this long-term demographic study we've been doing in collaboration with Hubbard Brook up in New Hampshire, focused on the black-throated blue warbler. Then I'll talk about a few experiments that we've done to try to understand rate implementation. And then I'll talk about this general modeling framework that we're developing. Okay, so to introduce you to some of the species, I'm just going to show a few of them. What I want you to focus on more than the pictures really is these range maps. And notice the similarities that we're going to see. Okay, so this is the chestnut-sided warbler. Similar distribution, very common in the Northeast US, Southeast Canada. A little sliver coming down the mountains. Golden wing warbler, Blackburnian warbler, blue-headed vireo, ruffed grouse, black-throated blue warbler, Canada warbler again. Okay, and it's not just the birds, right? So if you're familiar the natural history of this area, we were talking about woodland jumping mice this morning, another species with very similar distribution. Okay. Brook trout, if you're thinking about fish, I can tell. Very similar distribution. Now, this has got to be one of the worst range maps I've ever seen. I don't think we have snowshoe hare in Alabama. I don't think we ever did. But now that you can find it as far south as West Virginia, at least, similar distribution. It's not just the vertebrates. Trees, many shrubs, herbaceous woody plants show very similar distribution. So, what's going on with these populations? Do we need to be thinking about them as distinct? Are they actually declining as a lot of models would predict? What should we do about it? So one of the first things to kind of get a sense of, are the Southern Appalachians actually unique in having a high diversity of these trailing edge populations? Former student Sam Merker went out and basically just took every range map of every bird in the whole world, clipped off just the bottom 5th percentile of the ranges and overlaid them. And that's what you're looking at here. So these bright areas are areas where you have high diversity of southern range markings. And you do indeed see that, just like the Rockies, the Southern Appalachians light up. In terms of the number of species, so this is just birds. We have, in some places, almost 30 species of birds that have this type of distribution. And they represent 20 or more percent of the avifauna here. So this is kind of a hot spot of trailing edge population diversity. You guys, I think, are all familiar with these forests, just some of my favorite forests in the whole world. We do a pretty good job of having public lands in this area, national forests primarily. And if you've been up there, you know it's characterized by these northern hardwood forests up at higher elevations, dense heath understory with rhododendron, mountain laurel. About to get really, really beautiful up there as things start to leaf out. So what's been going on here? Well, lots of changes. So even though a lot of this land is protected in some sense or another, we've lost 2 of the most important foundation tree species in the eastern forests with American chestnut, eastern hemlock. I mean, we haven't completely lost these species, but functionally we have. And so if you go up to our study area, you see lots of places that look like this, where we once had these massive hemlocks. They've all died because of the woody adelgid. And you think about those trees provide more shade than most, right? Very dark and shady under hemlocks. We're losing those species. When my dad was a kid driving through here, you could see all these giant dead stumps of the chestnut. So this is rapid change in terms of the tree species. There's also a lot of development, as you know. No slope seems to be too steep these days for development. And of course, we've had climate change. So here's some climate data from our study area. This is collected by Nanohill National Forest and the Calvita Hydrologic Lab. So we have indeed seen temperature increases at our study area. There's not a clear trend in precipitation, just a directional trend, but we have seen, this is the variance here, not just the average. And what we've seen is the variability in precipitation has increased quite a lot. So we get more, unusually wet years and more unusually dry years. And our text can attest to that, especially these super wet years we get up there. So what's going on with the birds? Well, unfortunately, the BBS does a really terrible job of surveying these areas just because there's not that many routes at higher elevations. So, take these maps with a grain of salt, but we do see some evidence that these populations in the southern part of the range have been declining. But what we've been trying to do is get in and collect more intensive data. So we established, when I became involved with the project in 2014, we established this array of about 120 point counts that are covering our study area here in Western North Carolina. So it's only about an hour from here. If you drive up 441 from Clayton up to Franklin, you'll see the Calvita Hydrologic Lab on your left. That's where we're doing this work. This is Mount Albert, about right here. And so you've got this climate, you've got this elevation gradient from about 800 meters to about 1,500 meters, and there's this precipitation gradient where it's much wetter on the west side than on the east. It's cool and wet, especially at the higher elevations. Tremendous salamander diversity, very wet spot. Okay, so we have point counts over this area. And what's remarkable really is if you're down here at 800, 900 meters, you don't see any of these trailing edge populations, these species that fit that bill. There's no black-throated blue warblers down there. There's no furies. There's no Canada warblers. But you drive up the mountain, not that far, and then you start to see them in very high densities. Okay, and to our eye, there's not some clear line, and so what we're trying to do is figure out what is limiting these populations. If we're going to understand how environmental change is going to impact them, we need to understand what's limiting their populations right now. So I'm going to show you some results from this analysis of this point count data that Heather Guy, a former student, did. So just looking at one species pair. Okay, so here on the left, I forgot to change this to actual English. This is a hooded warbler. Bird people using these abbreviations. So we got a hooded warbler on the left. This is a species that occurs right at the center of its range. You can think of it as a warm adapted species. So here what we see is at the low elevation, so this kind of orangish color here is below 1,000 meters. The population density is pretty high and there's been maybe a slight increase. At the middle elevations, the population has definitely been increasing. So this is evidence that this warm adapted species is actually moving upslope somewhat. They're still pretty rare at the highest elevations. If you look at the Canada warblers, sort of the classic trailing edge population, we see the opposite pattern. So up high, their densities at the higher elevations, their densities were quite high, but they've been declining. And we've been seeing declines at the middle elevations as well, and they just don't occur down. So how general is that? Well, Heather analyzed the entire community of birds that we had in our data set with enough detections. And you see that this is pretty strong difference we're seeing between trends. So this is your percent yearly change in abundance. So it's your trend estimate. For species that occur at the core of their range, they tend to either be stable or a lot of them are actually increasing. Whereas populations that are right there at the southern edge of their range are either stable or decreasing. Okay, quite a big difference there. And when you look at community metrics, so going back to 2014, these brighter spots here are areas at the high elevations that used to be dominated by these trailing edge populations. So about 60% of the avifauna used to be trailing edge populations. Now that's down to between 40 and 50% at those same sites. So we've got this kind of encroachment of these warmer adapted species up into the higher elevations. So there is evidence of population declines. And I'll show you even some more with black-throated blue warblers. So there's this question of, well, okay, but it's just the population. If we lose it, are there any bigger impacts? Well, clearly with this many species, there could be impacts on ecosystem functioning. But one thing we've looked at recently in a couple of different ways with mitochondrial haplotypes, microsats, and now with Tristan Rueg and her group doing SNPs, we're seeing that there is, in fact, a lot of genetic structure throughout the range. So these southern populations, I mean, you can see them. They're geographically distinct from the northern populations, and they're also genetically distinct as well. So this is this cluster analysis where it's these assignment probabilities. So each one of these bars is assigning a genotype to a population, and we see that the southern populations are quite distinct from the other two. And we're even seeing some evidence that there's more difference between the southern and the northern populations here than there is between the northeastern and the northwestern, even though these are much farther distances. Okay, so we see that they're unique, we see they're declining. What we're trying to do is more than just predict, are they going to decline? We're trying to understand what mechanisms are involved so we can try to inform conservation efforts and really understand the processes causing these declines. So when you think about species, limitation of species distributions, you often think in terms of these two categories. So biotic interactions, things like competition and predation, versus abiotic factors like direct physiological constraints, barriers to dispersal, things like that. So we're trying to address hypotheses associated with each of these kind of classes of factors. And what we really want to do is take a demographic approach where we understand how these factors influence survival, influence reproduction, and influence dispersal, which is really kind of the hardest part of these birds. One of the main questions is, are these populations, is all these changes going to cause these populations, basically, you might have heard that phrase, you know, on the escalator to extinction. Are they just going to, reproductive rates going to go down, survival rates going to go down? Are they just going to move up slope and blink out? Or will they be able to track their climate optima and shift northward through dispersal? Okay, so now I want to focus just on this one species. This is the black-throated blue warbler. You can see a female on a nest, so we spend a lot of time trying to find these nests. This is maybe the easiest of all the songbird nests to find because they occur like head height, but they also occur in these dense rhoda. So it's pretty tough, even though they're one of the easier ones, and that's a male seedling. So this project was started by Bob Cooper, who recently retired at UGA. But it was kind of started to be the sister project of the work that's been done at Hubbard Brook Experimental Forest in New Hampshire, which has been, they've been studying black-throated blue warblers there since the 60s. Richard Holmes and others have been doing some really amazing work there for a long, long time. And what we have, the data I'm going to be presenting are mark recapture data and nest monitoring data that have been collected from both sites since 2002. And at each of these two sites, we have these three long-term plots. So intensive plots where we try to find every nest best we can and keep track of density and band as many of the birds as we can to get that information about survival and reproduction. So at each site, there's three plots that are at different elevations. So low elevation, mid elevation, and high elevation. So let's just look at what's going on with this population. So on the left, we have our data from down here, so at Coweta. And we see exactly what you would expect under climate change effect hypothesis, where the lower elevation plot, it actually went functionally extinct just before 2000. Okay, so the population declined to the point where there was really only one pair left. The home ranges were getting bigger and bigger as sort of the quality of the site was declining. I'll show you some more information about this site, but they stopped, Bob Cooper and others stopped doing work there because there were no birds left. And we go back and check every once in a while, there's still no birds down at that low elevation site. Our middle elevation site is also shown in decline, whereas the high elevation site has been pretty stable. Up in New Hampshire at Hubbard Brook, we see a lot more stability at each of the three plots. But as I'll show you in a minute, there's some evidence that the demographic rates are actually declining, and the forecasts indicate that they might not be stable. This is some work that Will Lewis did as part of his dissertation. Okay, so here are those forecasts. So now up top is our southern population, these trailing edge populations. And so the blue is what I showed you earlier. The green are these forecasts that we've done. So to try to get at population viability, we can use these models we developed to predict out into the future and what's going to happen. And so we're seeing that there's a good chance our middle elevation plot is going to go locally extinct. The high elevation plot is not likely to, but there's a lot of uncertainty there. Given the changes that we've been seeing, this trend in some of the demographic rates, we're predicting that the low elevation plot at Hubbard Brook is also likely to blink out, where the other two appear to be stable. So what about those vital rates? With mark recapture data, you can't get it exactly where you want in terms of being able to distinguish mortality from permanent immigration. So we use this phrase apparent survival. It's the probability that a bird survives and stays on your plot, okay? There's a lot of uncertainty here, but in the trailing edge, what I want to draw your attention to is that our two plots that have been declining, we do see these decreases in recruitment. So this is the rate at which new, essentially what called second year birds come back to the population. So we're seeing some decreases in recruitment, some evidence of some changes in apparent survival. There doesn't seem to be a recruitment issue up at Hubbard Brook, but there have been these decreases in apparent survival. So what is driving that? What's causing changes in recruitment? Well, because we monitor all these nests almost always fail because of predation. So there's a lot of nest predators up there. Everything is happy to eat eggs. And so most of these trends are trends because of nest predation. What we're seeing is that all three of our plots at Coweta, we're seeing decreases in nest survival. So the probability that a bird is able to successfully raise a bunch of eggs, and that the nestlings are able to fledge. Okay, so we think this is part of the reason that recruitment has been going down, is because decreases in nest survival. They're just not producing as many individuals. And one thing you'll notice is this is our high elevation plot again in blue. It used to be kind of a refuge. You know, the nest success was quite a bit higher than at the other plots. And now more recently, that has come down to be in line with some of the other areas. A little bit more variable at Hubbard Brook, but they are also seeing this decrease in nest success at the higher elevations, suggesting that possibly some of these nest predators, just like with some of the birds, are actually moving upslope. On the 6th day, so when nestlings are 6 days old, we go in and take some measurements. We're also seeing evidence that nestling mass, so these are these 6-day-old birds in the nest. This has been decreasing steadily at all three of our sites as well. And this suggests that we have some food limitation issues going on. These are all insectivores. They're like all arthropods, spiders as well. And we're trying to, we measure lepidopteran larvae and caterpillars. We do ways of trying to capture changes in the prey availability, but this is one of the really difficult things about studying these birds, is actually directly studying their prey. But this is telling us that there's an issue going on with decreases in nestling mass. Okay, so that's getting at survival, reproductive rates. The hardest thing to get at is dispersal. So is it, again, survival and reproductive rates are going down? Is that what's driving these population declines, or is dispersal actually playing a role? These birds are tracking climate change through directional dispersal. Well, so what we do is we ban those birds as nestlings. They have to fledge. They have to survive as these little helpless fledglings for a couple of weeks. They have to grow their feathers out, fly all the way down to Central and South America, fly back. Then we have to find them to get one dispersal event. Okay, so that's really hard. And in most places, they have almost zero success at finding any of these returning birds because you know, needle in a haystack in these big national forests. So I say all that because I'm really proud that we have 24 natal dispersal events. We've banded over 2,000 nestlings. And for us, 24 observations of returning birds is huge. So we view this as a giant sample size, even though I think most people would view it as small. But what this is showing a map of those 24 events. Okay, so this is the climate gradient shown here by the heat map. So these blue areas are the high elevations, cooler sites. You notice we don't find any nests down at the lower elevations in the warmer areas. But each arrow is a dispersal event, or when there's a number by it, you know, greater than 1, this is 3 individuals moved from this location to that. So 3 of these natal dispersal events were here. Most of what you see is birds. If you're born up at the higher elevations, you stay there. There is some movement towards the other kind of bluer areas. Sometimes birds make longer movements from warmish to cooler, but you never see movement in this direction. Okay, so kind of the null model would be just random dispersal, and you would see some birds moving down into the warmer areas, but we never see that. For the adults, it's a bit different. So we have over 1,000 adults banded. 190 of those we were able to recite. And here, look at this, 89 birds that were banded here as adults stayed in the same, just came back the next year in the same year. So really high site fidelity for the adults, not much movement at all. And so we fit some movement models to these. They're not the kind of movement models you can fit with giant telemetry data sets, but just to estimate simple dispersal kernels as a function of this climate gradient. And what I'm showing you here is this estimated dispersal kernel for an individual adult that we abandoned here. And you see that it's really symmetric, and that what it's saying is that if it comes back, the probability, the place that's most likely to come back to is where it was last year, right? This is the high elevation, this is sort of the lower, warmer area down here. So you see that for a bird born kind of in the warmer areas, same thing for an adult, not born, for an adult that started out at the higher elevation. So it really doesn't matter where you started. If you're an adult, you're going to come back to the same place. However, what this dispersal kernel looks like for natal dispersal is pretty different. So if you were born down here, the most likely place you're going to come back, if we're able to, if you do come back at all, is directional, to the point that you're more likely to move somewhere towards the cooler area. So you see this kind of asymmetric dispersal. But if you're born up top at the highest elevation, you're most likely to stay. So this is our first evidence that dispersal might actually be directional. So they might have some capacity to track optimal conditions, primarily not as adults, but in their first dispersal event when they return. Okay, so that's market recapture data, observational data. What I want to talk about now is a couple of experiments that we've done to look at these biotic interactions and direct abiotic effects. And these are motivated by some old kind of biogeography theory going back to Dobzhansky and others. This quote up here, where physical conditions are easy, interrelationships between competing and symbiotic species become the paramount adaptive problem. MacArthur said something similar. He said, southern edges of ranges pose special problems. There are many cases of non-climactic range limitation, many of which are competitive. So the idea here is that at high latitudes where the weather and the climate is extreme, you would expect populations to be limited by those abiotic factors. When you're closer to the equator, you would think with higher diversity, biotic interactions might be more important. So this is the whole hypothesis. Okay, so we wanted to do some experiments to try to understand the role of competitions plan, which is notoriously difficult in general. But we've done this a couple of ways. This is one of the species pairs we've looked at. Again, Canada warbler, hooded warbler. And the predictions we have, so I'm actually going to show you a little bit of observational data. We fit these two species occupancy models. So be thinking in terms of what's the probability that a species is present given that the other one is there. So we would think that the probability of local extinction, so the probability that the species blinks out, should be higher for Canada warblers when hooded warblers are present. So if you have a place where there's Canada warblers, hooded warblers show up. If there's competition, you might expect Canada warblers to disappear. Conversely, the colonization probability should be lower at a site where hooded warblers are already present. The presence of the competitor, if competition is really strong, might be a better predictor of occupancy than the environmental variables. And here's where the experiment came in. Hooded warblers, you would expect if there's interference competition, at least, you might expect there to see actual aggression between Canada warblers and hooded warblers. Okay, so I'm first going to show you the results of these two species dynamic occupancy models. Okay, so here's our climate gradient again. In the background, these crosses are the point count locations. Red circles indicate how many hooded warblers were detected. Blue are how many Canada warblers were detected. So if you just look at the data, you see the Canada warblers are up at the higher elevations. We got a little more money, so we did some more point counts to the west. Again, you see Canada warblers, higher elevations, and in the wetter areas to the west, hooded warblers down low. So the question is, if you've got a site like this and hooded warblers show up, does that impact Canada warblers? And we see some of those events where you can see some overlap with the two species. So what do the data say about those events? Well, what we found out was that there was almost no evidence of direct competition or competition as viewed through the lens of these occupancy models. So we see that hooded warblers their occupancy is really well predicted by the climate gradient. Same with Canada warblers. The difference between these two lines is the effect of competition. So this is what occupancy looks like when you do. So Canada warbler occupancy looks like when you do have hooded warblers present versus when you don't. And there's almost no difference. Okay, so even though there's really strong spatial segregation and it looks like one species might be limiting the range of the other, the data suggests that no, it's really just more of niche partitioning going on. Okay, so how do we look at that experimentally? Well, Sam Merker again did this experiment. He had a wood carving friend that he got in touch with, and we carved these decoys for us. So that's Canada warbler decoy, that's a hooded warbler over there. And what we did was we simulated these territory intrusions. So what happens if you go into a hooded warbler territory, you stick a Canada warbler right there in the middle of it and just start blasting Canada warbler song? Do they respond? And vice versa. We had some controls here as well. And I really meant to load this video in advance. It's on YouTube, and I'm afraid to pull that up because there'll be terrible advertisements, but maybe afterwards I can pull that up. But what I wanted to show you first is that you might look at those and say, all right, well, he's a pretty good woodworker, but do the birds really see that as an actual individual? Well, this video shows us taking this hooded warbler decoy, putting it in a hooded warbler territory and doing playback, and the actual bird just dives bombs the heck out. I mean, it's just a vicious attack of this poor decoy. He's standing on his head, pecking out, really giving him the full treatment. So there's no doubt that they actually view these as actual birds and they attacked. But when we did the swap, there was almost no response. So hooded warblers could care less if there was a Canada warbler decoy there and vice versa. So almost no evidence of direct aggression. So all these predictions we had about competition being important here, we feel pretty good that we can rule these out. There's still a chance of exploitative competition, so indirect through resources. They might both be impacting the resources and influencing each other that way. But in terms of interference competition, we don't think there's much evidence, which goes against those early hypotheses. Heather Gaia did some similar work with a different species pair where instead of occupancy models, she used these individual based models, and we had a similar result as well. Okay, so shifting gears, this is the other experiment I want to talk about. We're again looking at the species pair, black-hooded blues and hoodeds. Notice these nests are really similar. They're actually both, you find them in the rhododendrons, similar heights. These are two very ecologically similar species. One's yellow, one's blue. I mean, otherwise they appear to have similar diets, very similar behavior. It's just that one is more common at the lower elevations and one's up high. What we wanted to know is if there are direct physiological effects of climate on these birds, we think that it would be most likely evident on affecting the egg. And sometimes we do find nests where 4 of the 5 eggs successfully hatch, but you have this one dud egg that's left. And we tend to see that at the lower elevations for black-hooded blues. So we were wondering, are eggs possibly adapted to their local climates? And what would happen if you take eggs from up at the higher elevations and move them to lower elevations? Will they hatch? The problem, of course, is that there are no black-hooded blues at lower elevations, so we can't move their eggs down there. And so we came up with this reciprocal translocation experiment where we swap clutches of eggs between the 2 species nests to see would they hatch in different climates. This is, so the predictions here, so if there are physiological constraints, we would expect the cool adapted species eggs to hatch at a lower rate if moved to warmer climates because they are at their range boundary. But we thought because the hooded warbler is right at the core of its range and it is moving up slope, that its hatch rates might not be affected when we move them up to higher elevations. Here again are the 2 ranges, overlapping in our study site there in southwestern North Carolina. This is probably the hardest field experiment I've ever been associated with, and all the credit goes to Sam Merker, because to do this, you not only have to find nests of both species, you have to find them at the exact same stage. So you had to find them right at building and have similar lay dates because to control for differences in development. So he was able to do that and do some of these swaps. He also did some controls where he moved eggs but put them back in the nest, and we had a lot of unmanipulated nests to compare. This was pretty surprising to us. You know, we had some hypotheses that we thought we'd be able to kind of scratch off, and this was one of them, but these results were quite surprising. So what we found was for black-throated blue warblers, the unmanipulated nests, the hatching rate, the probability an egg hatches is quite close to 1. If you take eggs and move them and put them back, there was an effect of that. And so in our controls, we do see an effect of movement. But when you move them to the warmer elevations, the hatch rate went down considerably, down to about 60%. Whereas for the hooded warblers, there was a movement effect as well, but there was no difference between the control and the treatment. They hatched just fine at the higher elevations. So this is some evidence that there might be a direct effect on physiology through egg development. We were not able, we put these eye buttons in the nest to monitor humidity and temperature, and we were not able to figure out exactly what the mechanism of reduced hatch rates was. We see both species actually don't do as well when you have very warm temperatures inside the nest. But this is something we're interested in exploring more, because the egg pore density and all these things we know can be adapted to local conditions. Okay, so now I want to shift gears again and just talk about if we're going to be able to really understand population dynamics, and we know there's so many processes involved, what would be kind of the ideal modeling framework to be able to understand demography and space and time and account for these different effects that we know are out there? Well, it would be nice if we could think about modeling survival, reproduction, dispersal, all in a spatially explicit way. It'd be nice if we could control for things like density dependence, maybe locally. Be nice to have a modeling framework that allows for biotic interactions, deals with things like various types of stochasticity, and includes individual heterogeneity. There's always variation due to age and size and plumage and all these individual traits. It would be nice to account for those as well. And to be able to actually fit models to data, okay, that's to do actual inference. That's what we're after. Matrix population models, integral projection models, reaction diffusion models, these common models that are used in more theoretical population ecology are great, but they don't all easily account for these sources of variation. And because they're not actually individual based models, you can't directly fit them to individual level longitudinal data like the market recapture data that we have. So I just want to briefly show this kind of modeling framework that we've been developing that's based on these spatiotemporal point processes, where these are really, you can think of them as individual based models of population dynamics that have all these key pieces in there. So they have survival parameters, fecundity parameters, movement parameters, and they allow for the effects of environmental variation in individual traits. Anybody that's interested in the details, we can talk about it later, but I just want to make the point that this is something that we've been working on, trying to do, and we've been able to implement kind of simpler versions of this kind of full modeling framework. And just one sort of output that you can get from these is you can directly model vital rates as functions of environmental variables, like in this case, elevation. And you see that some evidence that survival rates, apparent survival increases with elevation, recruitment decreases with elevation. And from that, you can start to get at things like, we think of population growth rate. You know, we often think of lambda as just this single number that describes a population and what it's doing. But here we can start to think about, these are density surfaces of lambda. So how does growth rate vary spatially? And how much uncertainty do we have in our estimates of population growth rates? So these are some of the things that we're able to do with this modeling framework. The challenge, of course, is that you know, for large populations, you just can't do this if you got thousands of individuals. But at smaller scales, it currently is feasible to fit these types of models. Yeah, I also get density surfaces, so actual animals per unit area maps, and we can see those over space and time. And you can see some evidence from this model of this range actually contracting a little bit. Density going down at the lower elevations and increasing at the higher. Okay, so to wrap up, we are seeing mounting evidence of population declines of these trailing edge populations, which are also genetically unique. These areas, these higher elevation areas that were historically kind of refuges with high nest success, high nestling growth rates, things like that, are starting to look more like everywhere else. They seem to not be quite the refuges they used to be. We think that this decrease in recruitment that we're seeing is probably a result of both the reduction in nest survival and probably the food limitation that's impacting nestling growth. We don't think that there's factors that are causing direct mortality of adults so much. We don't think there's variations impacting that, but we do think that these changes in apparent survival are actually the result of this natal dispersal. So birds are recognizing that the environmental conditions are deteriorating and actively moving to higher elevations. And we're seeing that things like competition appear to be less important than theory might predict, and really physiological constraints might be more. Looking ahead a little bit, Urvi Gupta, another student working on this project, she's trying to do all this through these tritrophic interactions where we have data on LEPs, so the caterpillars, how that affects nestlings, while you also have changes potentially in the distribution of predators. And for you mammal folks out there, it might be most of you, we're getting some cool camera data from our nest. We're seeing actually a fair number of long-tailed weasels up there. Huge diversity of nest predators, everything from owls and chipmunks, you name it. We're getting them on our cameras. All the dispersal stuff we did, was based on just resighting of color-banded birds. Working now with Clark Rushing and some of his students. And Jen Brown is a new student working with us to try to use MODIS technology to get a better sense of movement and track some of these birds. This is one of the MODIS towers we stuck up here. Bears just love knocking these things down. If I got a good bear to turn ideas, I should happy to do. But yeah, I'll wrap up there. So many people think, I want to especially thank Bob Cooper, who really got the ball rolling on this project many years ago. But many excellent grad students, tons of great field techs, and really have enjoyed working with these high school students as well. So with that, I would be happy to take any questions.
So hopefully super quick. Did you notice any other interactions between the hooded and the Canada warblers from besides like an absence of the aggressive behaviors? Were there any other behaviors that were displayed?
Nothing that really stood out. Yeah, for the most part, they really just appeared to be normal. Early in the season, when you're watching these birds set up territory, it seems like they'll kind of fight anything that's around. But for the most part, you see that a lot where these species, they're very territorial and aggressive. So the intra-specific competition is really high, but you just don't see a whole lot of interspecific interactions.
Saw an increase in the mass of the fledglings in the nest, and you were thinking about doing with the caterpillars and stuff like that. Is it possible that there's also a chance that they sort of, as temperature rises, they're losing hunting time? Like if there's an overheated time in the middle of the day and it's getting larger?
That's a really good point. I mean, we think of these areas as being cool, but during the middle of the summer, they can be quite warm. So it is possible that it's affecting provisioning, not necessarily because of changes in the prey base, but just because of, like you're saying, energy budgets. And so, yeah, that's a good idea. we haven't been able to look at that.
I don't know how you measure that, but
I mean, yeah, you can do, intensive behavioral observations and follow these birds around and record foraging behavior. So it's something that we could possibly look at.
When you had the eye buttons in the nest, did you notice any like frequent nest breaks in areas that were warmer? And like, is that also contributing to the fecundity going down?
Yes, so that paper that I cited there, that was just accepted, there's a lot of stuff in the appendices. That data it's hard to deal with, but yeah, it's really cool because you can see when birds are incubating and when they're off the nest, and you can analyze sort of the incubation length periods and the forage. They're usually foraging when they're off the nest. So there is some insights you can get just from those temperature profiles, but they were really noisy and it was pretty difficult to pinpoint, what were the differences that caused these reductions in hatch rates.
In addition to like food availability in your gardens, is it possible that parental care is changing? Are the birds getting wiser to predators being there and altering their nest visitation frequency and time at nest?
Yeah, great question. So we know that, there's been those studies where they just blast playback of nest predators, and you see really, in some cases at least, not always, but you do see some response in parental behavior where birds become less likely to get off nests and forage and things like that. We don't have any direct evidence of that here, but yeah, it's definitely a possibility someone could look at.
Is it possible to get any data on the failed eggs and what caused the failures, if it's simply just the nest overheating or if there's anything else going on?
That's something I would love to do. I would love to work with a real physiologist and actually take measurements of pore density and gas exchange. I mean, the egg is just so remarkable. They're breathing. And so, it makes sense that a small change in climate could really impact sort of gas exchange rates and temperatures. Parental care, almost all birds, so from penguins to these warblers, there's kind of this optimal microclimate that they try to meet when they're incubating. And they're remarkable in how well they can do that regardless of ambient temperature, but of course they have to get off the nest a lot. So the thought is that it's really what's happening when they're off the nest that's likely impacting the eggs. Yeah.
Blanking on what I would call this, like what about like cascading effects of climate change? Like we found in Wisconsin that with climate change, the black flies were hatching earlier than before, so they were harassing the whooping cranes while the whooping cranes were nesting, when before they didn't sink. And so the whooping cranes were getting annoyed and leaving.
Yeah.
So like, have you looked at anything like that?
Yeah, great question. That's something that Irvy's interested in. There's all these questions about phenology. The rate at which birds can adjust their arrival times versus the rate of emergence of the Lepidoptera larvae. So yeah, there's absolutely many sort of indirect pathways through which you can have these climate change effects. It's all happening at the same time, so it's really hard to piece it all out. I know that's amazing work that's been done with the whooping cranes. But yeah, we think that the predator distributions are shifting as well. So yeah, it's definitely, it's quite likely that that's happening. And we're slowly trying to chip away at some of those processes.
Right.
All right, thank you so much.
Thank you again.
Yes.
I can't eat today.
Why?
Oh, I'm sorry.
I tried to-
Avoiding food.
To Mountain Dew.
It's justified, it's partly. Doing fine. Stereotypically teenager probably. Driving the car. So, others not doing all right. Almost, people who say, I don't think you were too as well, but our title, it's just kind of changed. 5 hours away, then I'm. Take that literally opposite. Oh, really? Okay.
That's really great. Very relaxing.
My mom, so my dad had his knee replaced 3 weeks ago, and 4 days later, my mom fell and broke her hip. So, yeah, oh, I have to, yeah, I have to do everything.